All right, hi everyone. We are Group 1 and our presentation is on the theory and implications of minimum wage. Okay, so minimum wage is an economic policy that implements a price floor for workers' wages within the labor market, which is depicted on the graph shown. In layman's terms, minimum wage sets a base requirement for the wage employers must pay their employees. Today, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. However, in the past few years, we have seen individual states raise their minimum wage requirement with hopes for economic and societal changes. So, minimum wage was actually implemented in 1938 through the Fair Labor Standards Act. Along with new labor standards to regulate workers' hours, conditions, and treatment, a minimum wage for all employees became a national requirement. By mandating a minimum wage, the government hoped to achieve four main goals: to reduce poverty, provide a higher income for the working poor, to stimulate economic growth and individual standard of living, and through the increase of purchasing power, and to cultivate equality and fairness amongst the working class. These goals included attempting to protect those in the working class and ensure that they receive fair and comparable payment for their labor. Finally, it was understood that to gain economic stability in the United States after the Great Depression, the government needed to pay workers more per hour so that they could function as consumers in the market and hopefully stimulate economic growth.
Pushes for a minimum wage began in 1831 in Lyon, France, where the silk industry workers went on strike with demands for a wage that was at least enough for them to live on. Their efforts both then and again 3 years later were unsuccessful, but brought widespread attention to the needs of the working class. Then in 1894, New Zealand enacted the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act, becoming the first nation in the world where the government set a minimum wage for workers. This law also simultaneously banned worker strikes and lockouts by employers. Almost 20 years later, in 1912, Massachusetts enacted the first law in the United States requiring a minimum wage, followed closely by California, Colorado, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wisconsin. After a legislative struggle, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which established a federal minimum wage of 25 cents per hour. In 1949, not noted here, Congress raised the federal minimum wage to 75 cents, the first of numerous increases enacted over the next 6 decades. I included this next one because it felt the most relevant for our class and the people in it. In 1961, Congress amended the FLSA to cover more workers, but also allowed retail and service businesses to hire part-time students at wages of 15% below the minimum, which is actually still legal. In 1963, President Kennedy signed into law the Equal Pay Act, which amended the FLSA to specify that workers covered by the federal minimum wage requirement were also entitled to equal pay for the same job, regardless of gender. Following a series of gradual increases, the $7.25 federal minimum that we know today was introduced in 2009. Lastly, as we see here on the timeline, in 2016, New York and California legislators passed laws raising their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now that we know the history relates to one of the goals we mentioned of reducing poverty. This chart depicts the hours required of a minimum wage for a single parent with 2 kids to reach 50% of the median income in their home country. If you'll notice here, in the US, that number is 50 hours. Zooming in further on the US specifically, we see that minimum wage is further varied across the country, specifically with higher wages found in the western and northern parts of the country, respectively. This is said to be a reflection of the cost of living, but it seems rather suspicious that historically slave states are those holding tightly to the federal minimum.
The first argument for minimum wage, as Megan mentioned earlier, is that the minimum wage can boost the income of poor families and unskilled workers. However, as you can see, one of the arguments against the minimum wage is that the majority of people who make the minimum wage aren't poor families and unskilled workers. Instead, they're actually young workers who are in college or in high school and part-time workers whose main source of income is not this job. The second argument for the minimum wage is that it can reduce the tax burden. So people who are working for the minimum wage won't use public services as much as those who are unemployed. So the government can save money on unemployment, welfare, food stamps, rent assistance, etc., thus reducing the tax burden on citizens. The third argument for the minimum wage is that it is actually an employment incentive. So people who are looking for a job would know exactly what their lowest wage is, and that would make it easier to compare jobs from a job with the minimum wage to a job without. And it makes it easier to compare the money they would get from the job to the money they would get from public assistance. So jumping over to the arguments against side, one who is against the minimum wage might use behavioral responses as their main reason to why they are against the minimum wage. So for many companies, the price floor set by the minimum wage is above employees. So they need to make up the money between what they would pay the employees, cutting employee work hours, reducing benefits, or they might even take it out on the consumer by charging higher prices. Finally, one last argument for that is against the minimum wage is that states with the higher minimum wage have a competitive disadvantage versus lower minimum wage. This is because most companies will want to move their company out of a higher minimum wage state to a lower one to where they can pay their workers less and therefore gain more.
Looking at minimum wage theoretically, we see that the implication of this policy is an increase in labor force participation and an increase in hours worked for those making less than the minimum wage before the policy was legislated. In order to depict the theoretical impact on personal consumption and leisure decisions, I'm going to walk through two examples. On this slide, you will see on the first graph when no minimum wage is instituted, the person decides to work 50 hours and consume at a level of $700 when being paid $10 an hour. Now, when a $12 minimum wage is put into place, this person should theoretically decide to work more hours, sacrificing leisure, and consume at a higher level. On these graphs, I exaggerated the impact of the legislation for clarity, seeing that it should cause the person to work more hours. The impact of raising the already legislated minimum wage would be a similar impact on the graph. Now, the second example depicts someone who enters the labor force after the minimum wage is instituted. In the first graph, the person gained the most utility from consuming all 110 hours of leisure and accepting the reservation wage of $200. This is the wage that they receive without working any hours. When the minimum wage was put into place at $12 an hour, this person has their budget constraint shifted upwards and now gains more utility from working $20 an hour and entering into the labor force. So again, we see that when we implement minimum wage, the budget constraint shifts upwards and people now decide to enter the labor force as well as work more hours theoretically.
So here we see 4 goals that Maggie mentioned earlier for the minimum wage. And now we're going to analyze the minimum wage to see if it's effective at accomplishing these 4 goals. So if we'll look at the first goal, preventing workers from living in poverty, let's take one worker earning $7.25 an hour, working 40 hours a week, meaning that they will earn $15,800 per year. This objectively is not enough to support a household, much less feeding a family of 3 or even 4. Now, as Maggie mentioned earlier, the minimum wage acts as a price floor, meaning that the wage increases. So now people are more willing to supply their labor because they'll get paid more. However, firms are less willing to hire and employ workers because it is now more expensive to do so. This means that the number of workers decreases. And according to Dr. James Reagan at Creighton University, the minimum wage disproportionately affects lower skilled workers. Because think about it, if you're making over the minimum wage, the implementation of the minimum wage does not affect you unless you lose your job. And the ones most likely to lose their job are those that have the least skills to offer. And we know that lower skilled workers are the ones making around or below the minimum wage before the minimum wage was implemented. Therefore, this increase of wages pushes them out of the labor market. Now, as we move on to goal number 2, as mentioned previously, we see that lower skilled workers are priced out of the labor market because they can't produce enough output to be worth the increased wage. Now, we also know that lower skilled workers are more likely to come from lower income backgrounds or are the youngest members of our society who have no work experience or skills to offer the labor market. And this creates a vicious cycle because if you're poor or have no experience, you cannot gain access to entry-level positions to the labor market. Now, as Dr. Reagan also points out, poverty is linked to income, not necessarily wages. So if you lose your job or the amount of hours that you can work, your income is decreased. Therefore, the minimum wage is not always effective at increasing income for poorer workers. Now, for the third goal. The minimum wage does in fact help some. There are a few winners who gain a higher wage, higher income, and can enter the labor force. However, there are losers, especially those who lose their job. And so we're going to look at 4 studies that all show a loss of jobs and or income. And the first being from 2017, when researchers examined the effect of Seattle increasing their minimum wage from $11 to $13. They found a decrease of employment by 7%, increase of wages of 3%, and earnings decreased by $74 per month. This $74 makes a huge difference for those living in poverty. Now, another study looked at 16 to 24-year-old males with no high school education. And with a 10% increase in the minimum wage, they saw a decrease of employment for 2.5% for white males and 6.5% for Black males. Now, 2 other studies researched the effects after the minimum wage increased in the 80s in 1990 and 1991. And they found that employment decreased between 1 to 2.5% for those aged 25 to 64. Now, for the fourth goal, employers pass on, or they have 3 responses to an increase in wages. So they could either just lose some of their profits, hire fewer workers, or pass on these costs to consumers in the form of higher prices. And economist Dr. McCurdy from the University of Chicago found that most firms respond to an increase in wages by raising their prices, which effectively negates the impact of minimum wage. So yes, you may be receiving a higher wage, but you're also having to pay higher prices. So this is technically not economically fair. We thank you for listening to our presentation, and we are excited to answer your questions. And now you can also take a look at our references.